Are you a gamer? Do you want to stay up to date on the latest gaming news? Then check out my show, the Gen X Gamer Podcast. I cover game reviews, gaming events, and the latest gaming news on the hottest games and much more. The Gen X Gamer Podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor.fm, and many other platforms. So head on over to where you get your podcasts and click that follow button today.
The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction.
Hello, my name is Les. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror. Alright, I've got a little bit of a different episode for you guys today, and it's going to be in a format of similar to the schizophrenia episode that I did with Kate Wallinga. And with me, I have a fellow who I used to know as Fred, your friendly death investigator, who we've learned recently his actual name is Landen. So Landen, it's a pleasure to have you here. Tell the people who you are and what you do.
Well, I don't do much right now, but yeah, I'm Landen. I host the podcast Autopsy, and I still use the term your friendly death investigator. I'm working on kind of a new show, completely different genre, but it's not really done yet. It's still other things are going on, but most people know me from Autopsy, and yeah, I kind of use it to deep dive into autopsy reports, and some you may know, some you may not know, and sort of break down how you get to the cause and manner of death. And the thinking was always, I listen to a lot of true crime, or at least I used to, and some folks would get a lot of this stuff either wrong or just slightly off key. And I was like, well, wouldn't it be nice if there was something out there that sort of corrected that, at least to some capacity? So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, and it's great. And I think a lot of my listeners would really enjoy your podcast because they tend to be the kind of people that like a relaxed, soothing podcast that, kind of might put them in a trance or something like that. And I think that's exactly what you do. You have a great voice for it. And it's very lightly produced. There are no loud, sudden noises, which I do from time to time. But it's a very mesmerizing podcast, and you find yourself getting lost in it because it's just so soothing.
Yeah, it's very. I guess whenever I made it, I wasn't really looking at other like true crime podcasts in terms of what I wanted it to sort of sound like. So it strangely sort of took nods from Lore, where if you guys have ever heard the podcast Lore, it's very kind of aesthetically the same, except mine's more true crime sort of related, but that sort of narrative driven kind of there's a soft music kind of in the background, and it's all more about the writing than it necessarily is about anything else. So
what led you to create the podcast?
Well, I've been listening to podcasts since I think early or late 2000s was the main podcast that at least I remember from back then, were like the Ricky Gervais show and Smodcast, Kevin Smith's Smodcast. And it was new to me completely. Like I'd never heard anything like this. I was like, oh, this is cool. This is people I know, just, because I grew up a dork, watching movies and listening to commentary tracks. And it was basically just like commentary tracks without a movie is how I saw it back then. I was like, this is cool. And then more and more came along. And somehow in my head, I eventually got it. I was like, it'd be cool because first it was like more well-known people who did it. But then you started hearing from, again, the lores of the world, you sort of saw what could and what could be like a podcast. So yeah, somewhere in there, maybe 2015, 2016, while I still was at GBI as a death investigator, I was like, it'd be cool to do a podcast. I don't know what I would do. I certainly couldn't do something like autopsy while I worked at GBI, because if they ever found out, they wouldn't tolerate it.
Yeah, a little conflict of interest there, perhaps.
Yeah. And so I just didn't really think about doing it. And then after the controversy at GBI and I was gone, I was talking to a friend of mine one day, and I don't know if she had ever brought it up before, but it was the first time that I just remember her saying, like, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? And I was just like, of course I have. What kind of question is that? And she was like, why don't you try to do, maybe you could do some sort of true crime, because that's what she listened to. And by this point, I hadn't really listened to true crime that much in a while. And I was just kind of adamant, like, no, I don't want to do that at all. That sounds like a horrible idea. And then she was like, well, you could do like an Emmy version of it, or a Southeast Georgia, or just the Southeast in general take on it. And I was like, okay. And then she brought up, and it's kind of funny you asked this question, considering what we're going to get into today. She was like, hey, you remember the Russell and Shirley Dermond case? And I was like, well, of course. She's like, those autopsy reports are online. And I was like, and it was one of those like moments of like, oh yeah, okay. Because sometimes you have to request these and you can't always get a hold of them, but every now and then offices will just release this stuff. And yeah, she didn't, I don't know, she didn't say specifically where to look for them, but she's like, it's not easy to find if you start looking. So I just went online and like, there they were. And I was like, huh. And I looked at it and started reading through Russell's case. And it was just that moment of like, oh, okay, I think I know I think I can make a podcast out of just this. And just started writing it without really knowing exactly what it was. And then kind of a few ideas started popping as I was writing. And I sent it to her, and she didn't like, she was like, this looks interesting, but I don't really know. I could hear it in my head, but I was sending her something on paper, and she was like, okay. She's like, I see what you're doing, but just, okay, I'll trust that you know what you're doing. And then I recorded it and sent it to her, and she was like, okay, I got it now. And that became Autopsy.
Nice. And for people who haven't listened to Autopsy yet, I've ran your promo. I've promoted you in my Facebook group and all that, but I'm sure that doesn't reach a lot of people that actually listen to the show. So describe your show for people if you would.
So like I said, I'd basically take every episode is one autopsy report. With like one exception where I did two in one episode, but for a very specific reason. But otherwise, every show was taking one autopsy report, and I sort of bookend it with like, I open the show where I sort of set up, it's almost how I used to have to write reports for the GBI once upon a time, where you get a case called in and they're giving you information and you have to write a narrative. And that narrative basically tells you everything that you eventually hand off to a doctor and they read. And it's just everything that leads up to how they got on their table that day. And that's sort of what every introduction to every episode sets up, kind of the who, what, where, when of where this case happened, how they were found, that sort of thing. And then once you sort of have an idea of where you're at and kind of what we're talking about, then we immediately jump into the show proper, where I literally I quote the autopsy report verbatim and in chunks, and sort of like go back and say, okay, this is what they mean here. This is what this means. This is what this means. This is what they're getting at. Piece by piece, starting with the external, and then I go into the internal. And then hopefully the idea being, by the time I get to the end of the kind of conclusion section where I give the cause and manner of death, hopefully by that point it's clear why they landed at what they did. And then the wrap up, like I said, is bookended. So the first part sets up where you're at to get to the autopsy. We go through it. We get to the end of how we got to cause and manner and what that was. And then the final little piece of it is sort of like, okay, and this is where the case sets today, whether it's open or closed or if anything else came up and that sort of stuff. And then we're out.
And for the people that may not know and may not have inferred this yet, you were a death investigator. And a lot of people generally, I think, and it was the case with me before I started listening to your podcast, I thought that only medical examiners did autopsies, and you had to have you had to be a doctor, and found out that's not the case. So you were a death investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. You performed, I'm sure it was probably hundreds of autopsies. What is that job like for people who may not be familiar with it?
Well, so every medical examiner's office is different. I can really only tell you how it was with the GBI. Most ME offices have what's called your medical examiner investigator, and there's various terms, though they're kind of all interchangeable. Death investigator, medical examiner investigator, medical legal death investigator, that sort of stuff. And you're working for a forensic pathologist, a doctor, the medical examiner. And you have your medical examiner investigator, and then you have what's called like a morgue technician or a forensic pathology technician, or they're basically your autopsy tech, your morgue assistant. Most offices keep them separate, two separate jobs, two separate skill sets, but GBI just has still has pretty horrible turnover rate. And they got it in their head, and this predates me getting there. So GBI used to have the ME investigator and the autopsy tech. And they got it in their head at a certain point, like, well, maybe we can keep staff, or at least the staff that we do have, we can make them do both jobs because we need a warm body to be able to do both. So they combined the position and called it Death Investigation Specialist. And that's the job I applied for and was hired for. And it's basically just combining it. I was a trained death investigator all on the job, and a trained morgue technician. And yeah, I did somewhere at least close to, if maybe not a little over, like maybe 1,000 autopsy eviscerations I started in 2012, and left in 2018. So yeah, you sort of average a couple of 150, 200 a year sometimes, of the eviscerations. And then however many scenes I responded to, how many coroner calls I took, just to sort of break that down, I guess, would be when you're an investigator, because I would say maybe the autopsy, most people would know, probably have a better idea of what that is. People know kind of what an autopsy, you're opening people up, you're taking their organs out, that sort of stuff. You're working with a pathologist who's usually in the room, unless they have to step out, but you're under their guidance or their watch. And you, the morgue technician, take out all the organs and kind of hand them off to the doctor, and they do their more kind of meticulous works. We always kind of said, the techs do the hard work and the docs do the smart work. So that's the morgue side, but the investigative side is you'll go to scenes, and again, office to office is different. This was the state medical examiner's office, which meant in Georgia, and Georgia's kind of complicated, where there's darn near like 200 counties in Georgia. Like Georgia has a lot of counties, and every county has a coroner, and coroners are elected officials. They're not doctors. Every blue moon, maybe one retired doctor will show up as a coroner, but that doesn't even mean they were a pathologist. So they get elected. Coroner goes out to a scene if someone dies on scene, and, pronounces them and kind of looks to see if they may or may not need an autopsy. And if they do, most of the counties in Georgia can't afford, to hire a medical examiner or kind of pay for that kind of stuff. So what they do instead is GBI provides the autopsy service. So the coroner arranges to have a body transferred to there's 3 GBI medical examiner offices in Georgia currently. There used to be more, but there's headquarters where I worked. There was one in Macon, and then there's one it used to be in Savannah. Now they've just opened a new building in Pooler, which is right out of Savannah. And GBI does the autopsy service. The pathologists determine the cause and manner, and then they relay that back to the coroners, and the coroners sign the death certificate. So as an investigator, you're talking to a lot of coroners throughout the day. They're just calling in the case information, and you're writing up the report. But there was one county that I actually had to respond to for scenes. So I was basically the acting coroner or me and the other investigators were the acting coroners for that county. It's not like that anymore since I've left. I don't know exactly how they did it, but it's changed since I left. But whenever I was there, I was actually having to go out to scenes in that county. So yeah, investigators, you do the case calls, you go to scenes, you talk to the doctor. You're almost kind of a liaison between the medical examiner and either law enforcement or the decedent's family. So it's kind of your job to, again, take the reports. It's your job to track down medical records as needed, and just whatever the doctor needs, they'll tell you, and you'll just do your best to try to get it. So those are kind of the 2 different jobs. And at GBI again, we did both.
You said that the coroner would determine if someone, I guess needs may not be the right way to say it, is a candidate for an autopsy, or, there's a good reason. What reasons would someone qualify for an autopsy?
Well, for state of Georgia, any homicide is an automatic autopsy. It's almost by law. Someone gets shot, stabbed, anything, a person killed by another person, they're getting an autopsy. Some suicides, if there's questionable circumstances, or just and this is the difference between a lot of some states. You can get some states where if someone commits suicide by, say, a firearm, and they shoot themselves in the head or wherever, if the bullet stays behind, it's still inside, like there's no exit wound, some states don't really care about that. They'll just be like, okay, it's a clear-cut suicide. We don't need to see it. They'll bury it. But in Georgia, I don't know if it's a written policy or whatever, but it's like if there's a projectile still inside the body, we don't bury bullets. So we have to, even if it's a clear-cut suicide, they left a note, there's really no question. But if they have a bullet in them still, they'd have to come in just to sort of retrieve it. And again, there's we'd look at a lot of hangings. What's a not crass way to say this? Because this was never a written policy for GBI. This is I don't know if I've ever mentioned this. I had to do a case once I was actually out on the scene, and it seemed like a pretty clear-cut suicide. It was a hanging. The person wasn't suspended hanging, but they had sort of wrapped the ligature around their neck and had pulled it tight. And when I found them, they were kind of almost in a sitting position, which we saw more often than not. But the guy was black. But everybody who I was talking to, his family and all that, they were like, he'd been depressed. The sort of typical things you hear and see about suicide. So I'm doing it and taking the information. I'm like, well, this sounds pretty clear cut. And I called the chief, the doctor who was chief back then. And this was my first year on the job, so I didn't know these things. And I'm running the case by him. I was like, it seems like a pretty clear-cut suicide, doc. We probably don't need to see it. And there's a pause. He was like, Landen, just bring that case in. And I was like, you sure? I was like, it's pretty easy. And he's like, Landen, you said he's black? And I was like, yeah. He's like, Landen, this is Georgia. We have a history. He's coming in for an exam. Bring him in. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, I got it. There you go. So sometimes you don't know when something comes in, and that's why I say the coroner makes the determination, but sometimes they'll just call us and say, hey, do you want to look at this? We don't think it's anything, but we just want to cross our T's on this stuff.
how did you stumble into this job? Did you just kind of want to go for it, or was it something you saw that there was an opening and you went for it, or how did you go about it?
Basically, I had before I started this job, I had no idea. Everything I just told you about what the job is, I had no clue about any of this stuff. Had never heard of it. But I went to college in Savannah. It used to be Armstrong Atlantic State University. Then it became Armstrong State University. Now it's absorbed by the Georgia Southern University system. So I don't even really know what to call it. But college in Savannah, I graduated with a bachelor's in criminal justice. And there's not a lot of particularly interesting careers in criminal justice, as I found out, unless you just want to be a cop, which I didn't. But right out of college, I was a corrections officer just for work. And I did that about a year and a half and knew within the first few months, there was no way I could do this forever. It was just, a corrections officer to me was just very, very miserable. So I was looking for anything else, and I had been thinking about forensics. I went and re-enrolled back into online classes for like cyber affairs and security, because that was sort of forensics based, as close as I could find. And yeah, I was just looking at job boards and suddenly saw Death Investigation Specialist on the State of Georgia website. And I was like, well, I don't know I have no idea what it is, but I know what it's not, and it's not a corrections officer. And that's the most important thing at this point. So I applied, and it was like a 7-month application process. From the moment I applied until day one on the job, 7 months went by. And I started May of 2012. And yeah, still, even when I got there, I still wasn't really sure, because the job description was vague. You know, you'll respond to death calls, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, I sort of have an idea of what that is. But then they just vaguely word like, and you'll kind of assist with eviscerations in the morgue as needed by the doctor. And I was like, oh, that's okay. I'm handing a doctor a scalpel. You know, that's the extent of it. And then I show up day one, and they're like, okay, we're going to put you in the morgue. You're going to train in here for however long. You'll train until you get it, basically. And I'm like, get what? They're like, you're going to do the evisceration. And it's like, what? What now?
That must have been jarring to hear, like, oh, here, we're going to go hand you a very sharp instrument, and you're going to cut this person open.
Jarring's a great word. They baby step you through it. They don't just hand you something and say, all right, go nuts. But you are around it every day, and you're seeing kind of what you're going to eventually be getting into. And you're just like, huh, I did not know I signed up for this. And most of the investigators who work there with few exceptions, were the exact same of like, yeah, we did not realize this was what we were signing up for. And that's why, like, that turnover rate, like GBI thought combining the positions would help, but they also just vaguely worded the job description. So a lot of people would get there and be like, yeah, no, they would just nope out of it within a month or so. But I stuck with it because I'd moved up. Like, I was from more the Savannah area, and this was closer to Atlanta. So I'd moved up there for this job, and it wasn't really what I expected, but I was like, I'll stick with it. And there was some good people I worked with too, who were just like, yeah, just learn to not think about it. Learn to make sure you're getting what you need to be doing right. And the more you focus on that stuff, the more everything else sort of becomes kind of routine and a job, and you don't really think about what you're thinking about now as a new person. And they were right. So yeah, I was trained in the morgue first. And then once I got it and had it down pretty well, then I went on to doing the investigative side and being on call at night. And I think right around the 6-month mark, I was like, yeah, I like this. This is great. I could do this an entire career.
When you say investigative side, something I'm not clear about on what a death investigator does. I believe it'd be considered more forensics. You don't determine like what weapon killed people or anything like that, right?
No. Again, it's more liaison-y, where you're getting called by an officer or a coroner, and they're relaying you information, and you're sort of writing it up and sort of writing out the narrative of all the events that led up to it. And you're asking, as you get better, you know the questions you need to ask for different kinds of cases. But yeah, it's the medical examiner themselves who usually determine, okay, so this is a homicide, a gunshot wound, or they were stabbed, and this looks like a serrated type wound with the blade. And they kind of, at least with GBI, they would kind of be adamant, like don't overstep, kind of, when you're writing your reports, don't sort of overstep what your knowledge base is. I mean, they didn't want to sound like condescending to you. They're just like, you're not a doc, so you can't. A coroner's going to call in and say, this is a homicide and he's got all of these gunshot wounds or blah, 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 blah. But when you write up the report, you're not going to list those wounds as gunshot wounds. GBI was like, you're going to list these as defects, and that's it, because that's all they are to you. They are a defect. A doctor will determine if that is a gunshot wound, even if you can look at it. And at a certain point, you're good enough at the job and you're like, yeah, that's a gunshot wound. You're still not going to put it in the report because only a doctor can make that determination, at least with GBI.
One thing that I'm sure people are wondering in their head is the smells that you're going to come across doing this kind of work. I mean, you'll be examining bodies that are fresh and some that aren't quite so fresh. So what's that like?
Yeah, the smells, it's the one thing, it's the first thing I guess everybody notices, including me. When you first start, you're like, yeah, you notice the smells. And it's sort of like, in a weird way, you're kind of almost thankful for the smells, because you work with an ME for, especially with some place like GBI, I'll say, because GBI is this big bureaucracy, especially headquarters. It's a very political environment. So there's so much micromanaging. And there was plenty of micromanaging with the medical examiner's office, but in terms of like higher ups, the smells kept most people out of that office. If they didn't have to be there, they would not be there. And even if they did, they would make their time as short as possible. So you sort of learn to appreciate the smells over time. But when you start, yeah, it's like, even fairly fresh deceased bodies, some people just don't bathe correctly and they have like a sour, that soury, unbathed smell was usually worse than any decomp could ever be. Because most people are like, oh, decompose, I don't want to, that's horrible, that's got to be the worst. And it's like, at a certain point, decomposed bodies, you just know what they are. Your brain just learns to ignore it. And it's also, and the way I always put this is, a decomposed smell is a natural smell. Whether or not it's a good smell, your brain registers it as natural. So, it's sort of off-putting at first, but your brain's not like actively rejecting it. I mean, some people might vomit, and there were quite a few people who would do that when they'd smell it. But the more you did it, your brain's just like, it's just a natural smell. It's a dead animal on the highway. It's rotten eggs. Like your brain sort of recognizes that. What it doesn't recognize sometimes is you get a deceased person who's already been embalmed, and there's sort of maybe even if there's just a slight decomp kind of smell, it's not so bad. What's horrible is that mixes with the chemical smell from the embalming fluid, and your brain registers that as that is not a natural smell, and it becomes very off-putting. Like your brain starts rejecting it. At least mine did, where you're just like, this is not, I don't like this. The smell is just not natural. And then kind of on top of that, you'd have the fumes, which you need. You should always have like a splash shield on anyway, but even it'll get under that. And some people would put the entire, I forget what, gas mask looking things to do that stuff. I hated wearing that stuff. I have asthma, so anything that would restrict my breathing, I always wore kind of as little. I guess I'd get yelled at this day and age. I was always wearing as little as I had to. Sometimes I wouldn't even wear the N90. Most times I wouldn't even wear the N95 mask, just because again, asthma, and I'm also mildly claustrophobic, so one would just make the other worse. So again, I got used to the smells. They didn't really bother me so much.
And that leads me into a question that my cousin, longtime supporter of the podcast, had. How do you scratch your nose if your nose is really itching and I'm assuming you've got gloves on, you might have body fluids all over your hands. What do? Do you just elbow it as well as you can?
Basically, yeah. Sometimes, I mean, if you're elbow deep in a body, there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do. You just sort of get over it and focus on getting whatever you're doing currently done as quickly as you can. But yeah, even if you're done, your hands are usually covered you're wearing gloves and all this stuff. But still you're covered in blood. So it's and you've got a splash shield on, which if you have a nose itch, you have to sort of elbow it up the, get the splash shield out of your way, just to sort of barely awkwardly rub your nose. And that would alleviate it at least enough. But you'd always it'd have to really be itching for you to really stop what you're doing to do that. Because once you do that, you have to get the splash shield back down, and then it's even more awkward, and you might even start getting blood everywhere. So it's one of those things it depends how bad that itch is.
You said it's mostly, we'll say, I think it would probably be fair to say that mostly homicide victims are the people who qualify for an autopsy. What about accident victims, people in a car crash, an industrial accident, things of that nature? Do they often qualify for autopsies?
Well, I would say, yeah, we got plenty of homicides, but the overwhelming majority of cases we had, and I really should, I guess, I don't know why I didn't think about it, but yeah, most of the cases we had were overdose cases, drug overdose. Because those cases, like someone can say on scene, yeah, we have, looks like an overdose, lots of drug paraphernalia, but that's a guess because you don't know what's in their tox. So they almost have to come in just to determine, exactly what killed them, because overdose cases, even if there is evidence on scene of what they were using, nobody was there most of the time. Nobody saw. So you don't know. So most of the cases were overdoses, but we had plenty of homicides. But in terms of accidents, we had, if it was a motor vehicle accident, we would sort of look at it, and this is another one of those things where some states may be a little different. If we had a motor vehicle accident, usually there would be charges pending. Like if there were charges pending against somebody else, and that case was probably likely going to go to court one day, they would want an autopsy, even if it's very clear this person died from blunt force trauma, or they were decapitated, or they just had open wounds that they bled out from that you could clearly see on scene. It didn't matter. It's like, we need to bring that in for, especially if they died on scene, especially, bring that in so the doctor can document the injuries, because that's going to be relevant to the court case one day. But if it was like a single vehicle, someone saw this motorcyclist like just darting down the highway and just weaving in and out, and ultimately he just nobody head on collided with him. It was seen to sort of have been like his fault, like where he tried to dart around something and then he loses control and wipes out and winds up dying of pretty, blunt force injuries that are very apparent. We wouldn't take a look at something like that. They would be like, yeah, he's got massive head trauma. We can see the skull fractures on scene. Everyone just says he was driving like a bat out of hell. Nobody hit him. There's no charges pending against anybody. So yeah, that wouldn't come in for an exam. But on the other side of that, if you say just take that same sort of another motorcyclist, and then that person is just found on the side of the road, even if it looks like they hit a tree or something, they ran off the road and hit a tree. If you find them kind of on the side of the road and there's no other cars around and nobody saw it, we might just bring that in just again to sort of cross the T's, because if nobody saw anything, nobody knows, there's always a chance someone could have ran him off the road or something else could have went on. So if it's an unwitnessed event, you would typically you'd bring it in just to sort of take a look and document as needed. Sort of the same with drownings. If you see somebody like struggling and swimming and there's a bunch of people who witness somebody kind of go under and then not come back up, and then the body someone goes in and pulls the body and the person's dead on scene, we might not take a look at that because that's a pretty clear-cut drowning. But if nobody sees it, if someone just sees someone swim off and then they turn around at a certain point and they're like, where'd he go? And then they start looking and someone dives in and a body's found, that would be more apt to come in just because nobody really saw him go under. You don't know exactly what happened. So sometimes it's a difference of witnessed and unwitnessed events.
Speaking of a drowning, and we're going to get into this a little bit later with a crime that we're going to go over. What about bodies that have been decomposing in water for a while? I would imagine that's probably about as gross as it gets.
Sorta. There almost becomes a difference between gross and kind of a headache of a case. Decomposed bodies, especially if they're like bloated, they become very cumbersome to work with. The skin slippage, they're slick, they're hard to maneuver, they have skin slippage, but they also kind of the oils that are sort of breaking down make it very hard to sort of manipulate a body as you're trying to work with an autopsy. And if there's maggots or insects or that kind of stuff, it's just one more thing to have to deal with. And yeah, if they're submerged in water or pulled out, that's just because now their clothes are soaking wet. Sometimes, decomposed bodies, their clothes are going to be wet anyway, just because the decomp fluid starts seeping out and it just soaks the clothes. But someone that's been underwater, I guess there's not too much of a difference. Like at a certain point, if they're decomposed, they're decomposed. The water might make a difference just for getting the clothing off and that sort of stuff. It all kind of depends. Drowning and decomp, it's just like, well, it's decomp that's the the thing you think about, not so much the water you have to deal with.
I'm sure that in the case of like a house fire or something, would you typically perform an autopsy on the victim of a house fire?
Yes. And I'm trying to just think of examples. Even if it was witnessed and somebody saw them inside and like heard them screaming or something like that, I think we'd still bring in that case to look at. Sometimes there'd be more left behind than others. Some people are burned beyond recognition. It's rare that someone's charred so bad that it's rare that there's like almost nothing left. There's usually always something left. And another thing, like they could be completely charred on the outside to the point where like their limbs, their arms and legs are just like nubs. But they could still have like their organs, at least their chest organs and probably the brain too, but the chest and abdomen organs, you'll open up and they're still mostly intact. Unless there was like an injury, like an open wound or something where like the flame and heat could get in, then that might mess something up. But most times the organs were usually intact if there was a house fire. And we did mostly I think most house fires did come in, if only just to ensure that it was either the heat that they succumbed to or smoke inhalation, just so we'd have to always check the neck to sort of look for soot in the airway.
Probably also want to make sure, because in some cases, it's an arson with a murder preceding it. So you probably also want to make sure that there's no gunshots or anything like that.
Oh, I've got a great story for a case like that.
I don't want to keep you here too long, so we'll get into one of the reasons we're here, and that is Russell and Shirley Dermond. It's a very well-known unsolved double murder of a couple, elderly. I believe Russell was 88 years old and Shirley was 87. They owned, I believe it was 19 Hardee's restaurants. Interestingly enough, they had a son who was murdered in the early 2000s. And the last time they were seen alive was May 1st, 2014. And a concerned neighbor eventually goes to check on them. And what did they find?
They found And yeah, just for listeners, this was a case down here in Georgia. This was a case that came to the GBI, and it was a case that I didn't do the autopsy of, but I was in the room for. Well, I should say I didn't help with the autopsy for Russell's case, but I think I helped with Shirley, if I remember correctly. But when they get to the scene, the neighbor comes and checks on them. They were supposed to be at like an engagement, like a party or some sort of engagement they never showed up for. And someone comes to check on them. And the house, I always like to note, the house was, save for the garage, and that's where Russell was found, is in the garage. But looking through the entire rest of the house, like the house looked immaculate. Like we were looking at like scene photos and that sort of stuff. Everything, I mean, you would have just thought if you walked into this house that these people had just stepped out for a minute and they were coming back. Didn't look like anything had been touched until you get to the garage. Garage doors closed, obviously, and there's Russell's body on the garage floor in a kind of a pool of blood. There was no other blood, I think, in the garage, save for what was around his body, and his head's gone. And to this day, they've never found the head. And there was maybe, I think, he had like one of his fingers, I think, was broken. Like there was looked like some sort of struggle type thing had happened. But otherwise, like no other major injuries, and his head's gone, and Shirley's missing. So he gets brought in for an autopsy, and yes, some very curious findings were found.
See, it says here he was taken in for autopsy on May 8th. 88-year-old male found in his garage. Yep, as you said. And the autopsy, it's a bunch of gobbledygook for somebody like me. And I know you've covered this on your podcast. So for a complete breakdown of this, I'll refer to your episodes on that. But essentially what this says is, other than the crush injury to his index finger, there are no other real significant injuries. His head's missing, but they believe because there was no significant blood loss from the neck, his head was cut off after he was killed. So are there any theories on what may have killed him?
The most interesting finding at autopsy, one of the most interesting findings I ever saw at my time there. Again, I didn't do the exam, but I was walking in and out. I think I was doing just investigative stuff that day, but this was just when you hear this kind of case, you're just like, okay, I need to go look in on this and see what's going on. Sounds interesting. So I'm walking in and I'm talking to the doctor who's working on it, and I walk over and she's just sort of looking at the neck. And I'm like, hey, doc, what's going on? And she's like, and she's just staring at it for a moment. And she finally just looks up and she's like, look at this. And I was like, doc, this is beyond my, this is beyond my level of expertise. I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at. She's like, look at the wound. And she showed me and she was like, the neck. Now there were two different wound sites on the neck. There was one that looked like maybe a duller blade or something had been used to try and whatever they were trying to do. There were evidence of that, but the main injury to the neck was a single clean cut. Like whatever was used to take his head off was so razor sharp. It went through it was all just one clean swipe. It went straight through the skin, and then it even went through like one of the bone. And she's like, I am pretty sure this is one clean cut. And she's like, let me go. She went and pulled another doctor from the morgue. She's like, hey, we were down in the decomp room just because this was sort of a high profile and it was a more private area. So she pulled a doctor from the morgue to come look at it. And he looked at it and he was like, yeah, that's what that looks like to me. And again, you never see something like that. And you just start to wonder, like, what did that? And there was no murder weapon found on scene. And there is, again, there's the question of if whatever they used was so sharp, why are these other injuries to the neck looks like something duller was used to begin with if they were trying to take the head off? What exactly were they using? Why didn't they just use the super sharp thing to begin with? So ultimately, the doc signs it out as craniocerebral trauma. She doesn't sign it out as like sharp force head injury as a cause of death because there was no hemorrhage in the wound, which at least told her that he was dead when his head had been taken off. So you just start to wonder, like, okay, maybe his head was taken up, maybe, and since his head was never found, you just wonder, like, what did this? Maybe they shot him in the head. Maybe they shot him and there was still a bullet or something, so they didn't want that evidence left behind. So they're like, okay, the head's coming off then. Or it was more of you almost wonder, like, is it a mob hit of some sort and that's why they took the head? But still, he was dead before his head was taken off. So you just sort of wonder, like, why? So yeah, it's signed out as craniocerebral trauma, just basically head trauma, not otherwise specified, because it wasn't necessarily the single clean cut that killed him, but we don't really know. The rest of his body, there was no other injuries besides the crushing injury on the finger. He had nothing else in his body that would have caused immediate death. So whatever it was had to be on the head. And since we don't have the head, we don't really have the answer.
Was there evidence of gunpowder found on him anywhere?
Maybe. I could be getting some streams crossed. I think maybe there may have been, because I've talked about this case with, you probably looked to Lee over at Murder Was the Case. And I don't know if he asked that question, but I was the doctor who, one of my doctor friends who was familiar with the case, she listened to that episode and she listened to us talking about it. And I want to say she pointed out, and I don't think it's listed in the autopsy report anywhere, but I want to say she pointed out there was some gunshot residue somewhere on I think he was wearing a robe or something. I don't remember exactly all the clothes he was wearing because I didn't even remember that. I was like, I thought he just had on like normal clothes, but I think she said he had on a robe and there was like some GSR somewhere on the robe.
Where he was found, do they believe that's where he was killed, in the garage? Or was he killed somewhere else and brought into the garage? And then, because again, it's been emphasized in every report that I've seen how clean their house was.
Yeah.
Do they believe he was killed there or killed somewhere else and brought there to be beheaded? Or do we even know? I don't know what's been released, really. It's because it's unsolved. They're not going to release everything they have.
Yeah. If you're playing the odds would say he was probably killed right there in the garage, because the moment you say he was killed somewhere else and then brought here, it's like, okay, if he's brought here and he at least has enough blood flow, because there's blood around the body still flowing out. So if he was brought from somewhere else, like you'd find blood somewhere else. Like it's really hard to really get rid of any of that kind of evidence. And contrary to what some might see on like movies and TV, like it's really hard to have sort of a different crime scene and then dump them somewhere else and not have some sort of evidence left behind that that's what happened. Every once in a blue moon, maybe. But with him, there was, again, the house was immaculate. The house, it didn't like there's any kind of struggle or anything anywhere else. It just looked like whatever happened went down in the garage. And as best as anyone can tell or assume, he was killed right there in the garage and not a second location.
Oh, that brings me to Shirley, because at the time he was found, she was missing. And she wouldn't be found until sometime later. And I haven't described it yet, but they lived in a gated community on the banks of is it Oconee?
Oconee, yeah.
Oconee, the Oconee Lake, pretty large lake down in Georgia between Augusta and Atlanta. And she hadn't been found, but they lived on the shore of this lake. A week, 10 days, I believe, later?
10 days, yeah.
10 days later, a fisherman finds a body floating in the lake. It was found to be Shirley, or they believed it was Shirley at least. And so they brought her in for an autopsy. What happened with her?
So, yeah, he's found. She's MIA. They start searching the area, and yeah, just sort of clear up, because you did that pretty well. Gated community, and and most of the houses in this community sort of backed up to Lake Oconee, so most of them had docks into it, and they had a dock. They didn't have a boat, but they had a boathouse. So I'm pretty sure there were cameras around the front gate. I'm sure there was. This is a ritzy neighborhood. And yeah, it just seemed to make, there was just seemed to be no way that anybody came in through the front gate and did this to them and wasn't seen. So the working theory is somebody pulled a boat up into the dock of the back of their house and got them that way. And that makes more sense when Shirley's missing, they don't know where. I don't know if they had started dredging the lake at that time. They may have sent in divers or something. But she's missing. They're searching the neighborhood with a fine-tooth comb. And then, 10 days later, a fisherman finds her. She'd floated to the surface. And it wasn't just like she was like a half mile down from where all this happened. I think it was like 3-4 miles away on like another part of the lake is where she's found weighted down. They had used cinder blocks. And this is something that Lee questioned, and I didn't have a clear answer for it. She's weighted down, and whenever they brought the case into us, I have a recollection that we had to take those cinder blocks off of her. So I can't quite tell you exactly how she floated to the surface unless it was just shallow with those cinder blocks still around her. But I recall that they were still around her when we started her exam. And getting to the exam, yeah, the cinder blocks there was a like paracord tied to the cinder blocks and then kind of around her ankles and calves. And I forget exactly what all she was wearing, but what seemed to be apparent with her was her death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head. She was beaten in the head to death, essentially. And again, I'm pretty sure I helped with her autopsy. And we saw some like hemorrhage inside the skull because by this point she was decomposed and her brain was basically just almost like mush matter. Like, so there's not a whole lot you can do with it, but you can, if there's blood in it, you could still see it. And there appeared to be some traces of like hemorrhage in the mush. So it was determined. And she also had like just massive skull fractures. So she was beaten in the head to death, essentially. And then when they sort of pieced everything together and the doctor was able to look at it, his determination was it was some sort of whatever the object was that they beat her with had like a rounded end to it. It looked like whatever had beat on her, a rounded thing. Possibly a hammer, maybe. That's what, looking at the autopsy and, just knowing that people kill people with hammers all the time, that would be the first thing I would think of from a cylindrical. It describes it as cylindrical. Yeah. Yeah. It could be. Yeah. But it does note that the cords that were used to tie her to the cinder blocks were obviously done after she was killed. So do they know if she was killed in the home? Is there any evidence of that? None that we ever saw. And again, you sort of have to play the odds. You can never really say. If they, at the very least, beat her in the head while still in the home, like the amount of damage they did to her head, like there would be blood somewhere. And they didn't take the time to clean up all his blood, but they would take, for her to be killed in the home and then move somewhere, you would think there'd be blood somewhere, but there wasn't. So it's possible, but that would mean they'd have to be at least mindful of blood getting everywhere as they were moving the body. I would assume he was killed right there on scene, and then I would further assume that whatever they did to her, they probably took her out on the boat and beat her there. And yeah, what you were saying, whenever they took the paracord off of the calves, the way you sort of determine that was after death is the doctor kind of just takes a scalpel and he sort of cuts into, because, you know, the paracord's pulled tight on the skin. So whenever you pull it off, like it's sort of, what's the word, bellowed or whatever into the skin, the markings from the paracord. And when you cut into that, you can sort of see if there's like hemorrhage around the area, and there didn't appear to be, which told the doctor that this had likely happened after she was already dead. So yeah, I would assume she was killed on a boat somewhere. And considering they had the paracord and the weights to sort of weight her down, that could have been an anticipated type thing. And then that just finally leads to like exactly what was the point to all of this.
According to the autopsy report here, she was wearing a short sleeve T-shirt, or a short sleeve shirt, a bra, a pair of pants. She was dressed as you normally would be for, you know, any normal day. And one thing I've been wondering, it's not clear in this autopsy, were there any defensive wounds on like her forearms or hands or anything like that?
I don't think so. I have them kind of in front of me. I can double check if you want to give me a second.
Yeah, I didn't see anything in there. It says, you know, the extremities show no scars. Nails are short. That's about it. That's all it says, at least as far as I can see.
Yeah, I don't recall ever like hearing the docs talk about that sort of stuff. I don't think.
So it's
far as I can.
It's very likely that she probably had her back to whoever killed her, and they just kind of attacked her from behind. Were most of the fractures, where on the head were they? All over, or just concentrated in an area?
That I'm not exactly sure of. Again, I'd have to because I don't know if I actually even mentioned that in my episode about them. I want to say there was part of the skull that was missing that they never recovered. It's probably somewhere in Lake Oconee. But in terms of like the areas, it was just to the head is as near as I ever looked into it.
And I would also go as far as to, and this is just speculation, I would speculate that Russell's head is probably somewhere in that lake as well.
That was kind of always, if you're playing the odds, thinking just like, okay, what are they doing? That would be my guess as well. But there's just the little things, like if you're going to take his head because say you shot him and you didn't want them you didn't want us pulling that bullet out, you would almost say, well, if you did that much, then why would you throw the head in somewhere where it could potentially be found, even though very unlikely, but still there's a potential, especially when they weighted her down with cinder blocks and, you know, it only took 10 days to find her. So it's like, yeah, they seem to think they whoever did this thought it out. I mean, that's what everything just feels like a hit of some kind. Like whoever came there, they didn't come there to rob them. Unless there was something
that no one knew about.
Yes. If there's some piece of information they had that they were looking for, because that's the thing about, is like, if they're just there to kill both of them, then why not kill them both on scene?
And also nothing appeared to have been taken.
Yeah, as far as anyone else, as far as we know, nothing appeared to be taken. Because you're sort of having to. This is where, like I sort of mentioned, like, you know, everybody's a suspect in the beginning. So I think the kids were under, because they have like 2 or 3 kids, and they were under investigation. And I mean, almost by protocol, they were under investigation because
it's the closest ones to the victims that you usually investigate first.
And you can sort of see, it would almost make more sense if they had sort of orchestrated this. Again, I'm not throwing accusations, but if you're just playing what you have, you've got someone that broke into their home that didn't take any, like, these people are well off, and it doesn't appear they took anything that we know about. And why do that unless, like, someone's telling you, hey, you don't take any of this stuff because this is all our stuff, you know, ultimately whatever's in their house is going to go to the kids anyway, in theory. But there's always the possibility that there was something that they had, some valuable piece of whatever that they had, the kids maybe would squabble over, and someone got it in their head like, I want that. But again, if that be the case, that doesn't really make much sense either, because then one of the other kids would at some point would be like, hey, where's this item at? Because that was the only thing you sit there and try to think your way through the case in terms of, okay, we're looking for a specific thing in this house. Mm-hmm. He's not telling us where it is. So we're going to make an example out of him to the wife, and then she's going to tell us. But again, you would still opt to keep her on scene until you got what you wanted, and then you'd kill her on scene. It just does not make sense why she was taken from the scene and then weighted down that day. It's very, very odd.
Yeah, it makes no sense to me either. And I didn't study this case all that deeply, but from everything I've seen, there's no known motivation for this. And I've floated the idea to myself that these people owned a lot of restaurants. Could it have been a disgruntled employee? Could it have been somebody? Was there some mistake possibly made on their paycheck and they wanted revenge or something like that? But there's no known motivation for this at all.
Yeah, and even then, like, if I had, and this part, I guess this is more a guess on my part, as far as like the Hardee's franchises go, I think he was more in charge of that than she was. So if there was a disgruntled employee, they would be more out for him. Yeah, if you want to kill him, then you kill him. And if she's there and you don't want to witness, okay, well, then you kill her on scene as well. But this weird thing of killing him, taking his head, and then taking her, and then disposing of her, and likely the head, in the lake, it's just like, okay, that's a hell of a disgruntled employee. If they did it, I mean, it doesn't seem, a disgruntled employee is this sophisticated and not leaving any evidence behind. And if they hired somebody, like they got their money's worth. Whoever they hired must have charged a pretty penny because they seemed like a complete professional. So it's no evidence
that I've seen left behind. Nothing.
Yeah.
There's nothing.
Yeah, for her, again, we don't know what took off his head, and there was no other. It was likely whatever was used to kill him was not the same thing that killed her, but there's no evidence, or there's no weapon for either that was ever found.
Yeah, and I would also think so, and I believe this lends toward the gunshot theory for Russell, because she was beaten to death. He was we don't know, but there's no defensive wounds on him either. So he was either caught by surprise or very likely shot. I mean, it's a baffling story. And I think that's why it's so well known. Not only are they this, elderly rich couple that own all these restaurants, but there's nothing there at all.
Yeah. And you just, like I had a thought of, you take him out, and then you eventually like take her out somewhere else. Like it just does not, because if you're looking at this again, it's another thing that just throws any theory sort of out the window. It's like this seems like a professional hit. Okay, well, if it's a professional hit, then you kill them both on scene. Mm-hmm. There's no way in the world you're gonna say, okay, we're gonna take her out on the boat and we're gonna try and talk her into keeping her mouth shut. It's like no one that's a professional, I would like to think, would give anybody that benefit of the doubt that they're going to keep their mouth shut. And then they're like, okay, she's not going to keep her mouth shut. Let's just kill her now. It's like, no, if it's professional hit, you would take him out on both scene, I would assume. So much of it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I guess that's where we'll leave it with Russell and Shirley Dermond, because I mean, like, I have to reiterate, there's just nothing. It's baffling in every way.
Yeah, and and I was talking to you, like the sheriff, I don't know if he's still sheriff. He was sheriff for there. This just sort of a random thing I know. This case drives him crazy from what I understand. Like, I think in his entire career, he doesn't have an unsolved murder under his belt. And if you're going to have an unsolved murder like this one, even if he did have an other unsolved murder, this one takes the cake by far in terms of just like, what the hell was this? So he's someone I'd sort of like to talk to. I mean, it's an ongoing case. There's obviously stuff he could never talk about, but I would just sort of like to get his opinion, because I know it drives him crazy, and I'm sure he'd like to say a thing or two about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there for Russell and Shirley Dermond. I've got a couple of questions from some friends, if you don't mind answering. Some of them are a little, so I got a friend who's got a bone to pick with Death Investigators. So,
Sure.
It's not too harsh. She's cool. So I'm sure it's all in good fun.
I've been a professional whipping boy in the past, so it's fine.
Yes, you have. And again, I'll link to the episodes that contain your personal story. For both Ignorance Was Bliss and Murder Was the Case. It's an interesting story. For the record, I think you got the bad end of the deal there. I think it was blown out of proportion. And I just wanted to say that on record. But I've got, this is from Carissa, early supporter of the show. She actually donated money for me to get a mic before I ever even started this. Why don't Death Investigators make embalmer-friendly incisions? Seems like they just slice and dice through any viable artery you can embalm through. Leave those internal carotids a little longer, pal.
To that, I would say, not my problem. The one thing they tried to teach us, to instill in us, was, tie off the carotids. And if we had all the time in the world to do that, we tried to, but we had, right now their caseload, from what I understand, is insane. Not that it was ever great when I was there, but, I would be doing 3, 4, 5 cases a day sometimes. And it's just kind of one after the other. And it's like, no, just go. You don't, even our stitch jobs, like whenever we would finish the autopsy and put the organs kind of in an organ bag and then put it back in the chest cavity, and then sort of kind of flap the skin back over, we would only just take a needle and sort of tack it together, just to make sure that like nothing, like that the organ bag wouldn't fall out or anything. We would never do like a very intricate like baseball stitch or anything. So it's like, I understand, but they didn't give us time to really do anything. At least with the GBI, we just had too much to do.
Yeah, well, that kind of points to our second question as well. Why not sew them up a little nicer before they go to the funeral home? So I think you answered that pretty well.
Well, I would say there was, and they didn't get criticized for this at headquarters, because again, headquarters is a very political environment. So if you sort of go off key in any kind of way, suddenly you've got 3, 4, 5 people like asking you the same question. It's the TPS reports from Office Space. You've got 10 people asking you about it. But in the regional labs, specifically around Macon, they never sewed up the bodies at all. And they did that specifically because their funeral homes told them not to do it. They do the autopsy. I think they would at least tie off the carotids, but maybe not. But they aspirate the body, so sort of take out all the extra fluids and everything. And then they'd put the organ bag in the chest, and then they just sort of flap the skin over, and that was it. They wouldn't tack it at all, because at least their investigator down there had talked to a lot of the funeral homes, and the funeral home was like, well, we have to cut that. We're going to have to cut it open anyway to do our job proper. So we'd almost rather you not even bother, because that's just extra holes you're putting in the body. So I would throw it back to them. Like, why do we do that at all if they're just going to reopen everything to do their more proper work that they have to do?
I don't know if I mentioned this, but she's a mortician. So that's,
yeah. And that's sort of why I answered that question that way.
And her third question, not so much a bone to pick, but what does it feel like to loaf a brain? Is it like cutting through cheesecake or flan?
Let's see. So basically asking the consistency. 'Cause most of the time the doctors did this, but every now and then they would be like, hey, you want to see this? And I think I did it maybe one time in nearly 7 years. But I handle, I would always take the brain out of the skull and hand it off to them. So the consistency was very like a sturdy gelatin type thing. So they'd have their knife to cut into it, but you can cut through the brain like fairly easy. It's not something you have to like really like pull out your shoulder by any stretch to saw through it. It's just, I'm trying to think of a good comparison. Like cheese is it's not as dense as like a cheese, and it's not as, I don't know, cutting bread is a little, if you ever had to actually cut bread, that's even a little like more aggravating than the brain. Like the brain kind of holds its form, at least like a sort of a fresh brain. It holds its form much better than like a loaf of bread would. But it's not nearly as like dense as a piece of cheese. So it's somewhere between bread and cheese.
And I have a question. You don't have to go into specifics if you don't want to. I get it. Is there a case that you performed an autopsy on that really sticks with you, besides the one that you're infamous, we'll say, for?
Yeah. Something that sticks with me.
I believe you've talked about it on your podcast, but it's been many, many months since I've listened to it. But I was just curious if there's one that just kind of, I don't know if traumatizing is the right word. It's just one that you haven't been able to shake.
No one case, I guess, but there's cases that sort of stick with you for different reasons. Like sometimes you'll see, most people would probably think like kid cases, and those can, but at a certain point, if you've seen like kid trauma cases, you're like, well, you kind of know what to expect. But sometimes it's the story that sticks with you in terms of like, if looking at a child death where a kid was like beaten to death, you sort of look at it and you're just like, okay, it's ultimately just like blunt force trauma, but the story kind of sticks with you in so much as like there's this case where I think it wound up being the mom's boyfriend, because of course it was, but history of domestics and all this stuff. But one of the key things about it is the mom, her dad, so this little girl's granddad was, I believe, the sheriff of the county. And you just sit there and when you, and this girl was beaten pretty bad. And you just sit there and go like, in all the cases where like a kid is beaten or something like that, there's, as much as you try to say like, could someone have stepped in and helped, that sometimes there just isn't any, sometimes there's nobody, but you're like, this kid had a granddad who was in law enforcement, who by all rights should have been paying attention. And you're just like, how does some of this stuff like happen the way it does, when it's like, some people don't have the benefit of having someone that could step in and do it, but this little girl did, but kind of here we are. So a case like that. And then I think I've talked about this case on my show before in one of the discussions. I just remember she was technically a teenager. I think, well, she may have been 11 or 12, and she came in as a hanging. And you just, I mean, it's rare, but every now and then you'll get a hanging case of a child. And this girl's story was just all over her face. She was wearing, like, she had this like kind of blonde, like it kind of looked like she had a bad blonde kind of dye job on it. It didn't look quite natural blonde. And the hair was just kind of like, her face was very adolescence awkward, I would describe. Like early adolescence, your face doesn't have much of a shape. So she had this kind of awkward look to her, like any kid that age would. She had this hair that it seemed like she was trying to do something with, but it just wasn't working. And then sort of the thing on top of that was she had these contact lenses in, where they were blue, but they were very, very cheap looking. They just looked like you would not look at her and be like, oh, she's got blue eyes. You would almost look and be like, is there something wrong with your eyes? And the case, when I say you just saw her whole story on her face, it was like, this girl didn't like anything about herself. She didn't like her hair. She didn't like her face. I think she had braces as well. She didn't like her eyes. She was everything about herself she didn't like and was trying to change. And I don't know if there was like bullying or anything involved at like school or anything, but ultimately she hangs herself. And I don't know if there was a note or anything like that, but you just sort of looked at her and you're just like, that's you even though you'll never know exactly what goes through someone's head. You just sort of look and you're just like, this girl just didn't like who she was in the world.
That's heartbreaking. Yeah. I could imagine that would probably be something that would stick with me through that, through the rest of my life. A lot of it would, I imagine. It's a very interesting job you had there, sir. And I'll take no more of your time. I appreciate you coming on here. Tell folks where they can find you if they so wish to listen to your mesmerizing podcast.
It's so everything I try to keep. If you just want a central location, you can go to autopsypod.com. All my episodes, everything I've done is sort of posted there. Patreon, if you want to support that way, is patreon.com/autopsypodcast. Everything's sort of early access, ad promo free, and everything I've ever done is there. Otherwise, any pod platform of choice, I'm kind of everywhere.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We'll have to do this again. Maybe we'll discuss some other strange or really brutal case or something. Who knows?
Yeah, this is cool. Anytime, man.
All right, man. Absolute pleasure. Thank you, sir.
All right, man. See ya.